Hi, everybody. I'm flattered that you're here. I hope I don't mess up too much. Okay, so I get nervous. I'm not like an academic person who lectures in front of students all the time. So I've got my information here, and I think you're going to find this pretty darn interesting. The term the global church is a relatively recent addition to the names we use to describe ourselves as a people, following President Dieter F. Uchtdorf's 2002 conference sermon titled The Global Church Blessed by the Voice of the Prophets. Publications and press from the church have echoed the phrase increasingly since, particularly when talking about global humanitarian aid, President Nelson's international travels, the church's multi-language Liahona magazine, its worldwide call for new hymns, and so forth. The moniker of the global church appears with some regularity by Latter-day Saint educators, writers, public affairs departments, and our own media when speaking about the church. When President Nelson and his counselors met the press for the first time as a presidency on January 16th, 2018, that seems kind of amazing that it was just 2 years ago, the church news described the meeting in these terms. The press conference held in the foyer of the church office building in front of a large mural of Jesus Christ and his apostles covered a wide range of topics, signaling the challenges and opportunities facing the global church. Today, I'd like to discuss with you the artistic ramifications of this descriptive phrase. If we think of ourselves as a global church, but the artworks we use and the artists we support do not include a broad spectrum of global artists, that signals a systemic issue, at the very least a missed opportunity. I think you'll be fascinated to learn today about a handful of extraordinary artists from Europe, Asia, and Latin America who are members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. In each example, a case can be made that they are among the most important artists in the church's entire history. So there's no condescension here, no mere tokenism. These artists are our A-listers. The fact that most of these names will be new to you suggests that we have a ways to go in discovering our own cultural history, in valuing our best fine artists, in learning from them, and embracing the vision of a universal family of Latter-day Saints. I should emphasize that these artists are just the tip of the iceberg. I could talk endlessly about artists of the church and increasingly artists outside of North America. The desire to explore, champion, research, and advocate for all of our artists in every artistic discipline is one of the most powerful drivers of the Center of Latter-day Saint Arts, the organizer of this weekend's festival, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to speak to you today. So my plan is a really simple one. I have examples of 2 women and 2 men, and they come from Europe, Asia, and Latin America. And today I'm largely sidestepping the issue of talking about things in translation and foreign languages by concentrating on the universal languages in these examples of visual art and music. One last thing before I get to these artists. Sometimes something that's really hard to do is to talk about artists whose names might be new to you quickly. Like, why would you, if you have no name recognition, why would you care about somebody? It's really hard to give the impression quickly of why an artist matters. If I were to say, so-and-so just won an Oscar, you'd say, oh, well, that's a name, that's a stamp of approval that you would agree with, unless you don't agree with the Oscars next Sunday. But so what I'm describing, but if I'm describing credentials or dropping names that have no name recognition for you, it gets harder, right? So what I'm asking is that you have a little faith in me when I say that these LDS artists' accomplishments are world-class and deserve serious attention. Let's take a look now and give a listen to 4 LDS artists from countries other than the US. So 3 of them are contemporary and 1 is from mid-century. So we'll start with Joseph Paul Vorst. He was born in Essen, Germany in 1897, converted to the church in his early 20s, escaped the rise of Hitler, and immigrated to the US in 1930 and became one of the leading artists of his day, exhibiting paintings of pathos and power throughout the Great Depression at the country's most important museums, fairs, galleries, even the White House. He was part of a wave of regionalist artists that included his friend Thomas Hart Benton, who documented the heartland of America in a tumultuous period of floods, droughts, poverty, fear, and resilience. Vorst was an active member of the church. He settled in St. Louis and remained there until his early death at the age of 50. He collapsed and died leading the ward choir, which is a cautionary tale for all of you. Aspects of his belief and direct references to the church run throughout his work. I have a photograph of him standing with President George Albert Smith in the prophet's backyard. The church was aware of him, at least a little, but then they lost track of him sometime after 1940. When I presented the Church History Museum with a story of his art and life around 2013, they owned none of his work, nor had any documents about his art in their archives. I mean, this is extraordinary. Here's a guy who exhibited at the Metropolitan Museum, the Whitney multiple times, the Art Institute of Chicago, all of the world fairs, published everywhere, great critical response, exhibits at galleries in New York, St. Louis, and across the country. He was an active member of the church, put artwork about the church in his work, and they were unaware of him. So something went wrong sometime after 1940. But to their credit, the Church History Museum was happy to remedy the oversight, and they gave him a full retrospective of his work in 2019, and then acquired a number of his paintings, drawings, and prints. The retrospective included borrowed works from the Metropolitan, the Museum of Modern Art, Crystal Bridges Museum of American Art, the St. Louis Art Museum, among others. When we were getting ready, I was the co-curator of this retrospective. The Church History Museum commissioned focus groups because they were a little bit freaked out. Like, no name recognition. How would people respond to an image of a naked black man praying across the street from Temple Square? And I was fascinated to hear what focus groups said. At one point, some of the people in the focus groups became angry, not because they disliked the work, but quite the opposite. They fell in love with it, and they said, "Why haven't you shown us this work before? Why do we only see the same handful of artists over and over?" That's a sort of interesting thing. And that impassioned response surprised all of us. Okay? Leilei Tian. It's entirely possible that the most celebrated composer ever in the church is a woman from China, now living just outside Paris. In classical music, one of the most ancient and prestigious awards in the world is the Prix de Rome, which Leilei won in 2012. Her list of awards, degrees, performances, commissions, recordings, residencies, and prizes is so lengthy and so distinguished, just reading through it would take more time than I've been allotted for my entire presentation today. She's that important. So what makes her music so impressive? Born in China and educated there, she somehow fell into the circle of the avant-garde in a university system that at the time was mostly closed to emerging contemporary Western musical ideas. She studied in Sweden beginning in 1997, and in 2002 she moved to Paris to study at the world's most important modernist music center, IRCAM. While living in Paris, she joined the church after a series of personal miracles, which she's told me about. They're quite beautiful and extraordinary. Her music could not possibly be more of the moment. She's a hybrid of East and West, old and new, masculine and feminine, soft and hard, and it's all to be heard in her compositions. Her music fuses these radically different cultures and attitudes. Sometimes she writes for orchestral instruments, Western instruments like things you know, violins, guitars, flutes, and she makes them sound like ancient Eastern instruments, eru, gukan, pipa, and jiao, and vice versa. Sometimes she's writing for Eastern instruments with the descriptions of how to make those sound like Western instruments, sometimes at the same time. You can kind of get that this is a pretty novel idea. She blends everything together in original and daring ways that are singular in music today. In a world of globalism, she embodies all the tensions and excitement of our planet's differences. Added to that is a layer of spirituality. Since her conversion to the church nearly 20 years ago, she's included LDS-related ideas in her works, including compositions titled From Amen to Amen, In Our Image, In Our Likeness, Paradox, Celeste, among others. So let's listen to an excerpt. This is about, I think, 8 minutes long, and we're just going to listen to it all together. It's a work for eru and guitar. If you live near Chinatown, where when you go to the subway, after Pizza Rat has descended, there's usually somebody playing an eru, and it's a stringed instrument. It has a long neck with some tuning things at the top, and a kind of a bowl at the bottom, and it's a bowed instrument with a bow that's considerably longer than even a double bass bow. It's quite a bit longer. And that's usually exclusively a stringed instrument. The work that we're going to hear is a work for eru and guitar. And the guitar is sort of almost in the flamenco tradition, the way that it's been written here. So here's the interesting thing. As you're listening, and some of the music will sound, slightly disorienting to you. It is to me too. But listen to the interplay of the sounds. And even if they're a little bit unusual, try to think, how are those sounds being made? And it's a 3-movement work, again, about 8 minutes long. The first movement is relatively traditional. Then they start swapping out. And the eru starts becoming almost a percussive instrument. And the bowing, including things like vibrato that are not normally guitar sounds, it's more of a violin sound than a guitar sound. They have exaggerated guitar vibrato, and then the eru starts doing some of that stuff. Then she asks for the guitarist to start using his instrument in a percussive way. In flamenco, there's quite a lot of this, but he's doing it almost like a rattle. I mean, she's doing it almost like a rattle. So we're just going to listen to this and try to imagine what cross-cultural barriers she's trying to bridge. It makes it sound like I've set up this really scary thing. It's not as scary as that. But it's good to, if sounds are new to you, she's not interested in melody. That's not what she's about. It's about the sounds and how sounds are made and why they're made. And so just relax with it and go with it. You might wonder how the center develops relationships with artists who are new to us. I had an email in November from a friend standing in the back of this room who had just been to Mexico City. While he was there, he met and interviewed a Latter-day Saint artist, Georgina Bringas. Her name was new to me. She had exhibited recently at the international competition of the Church History Museum, but the full range of her work was quite different in style and ambition from the submission to Salt Lake City, and I was blown away by her work and the brilliant and probing ideas behind them. She's working with some really interesting materials: tape measures, thread, rope, audio tape. Her installations are absolutely arresting, as you can see here, but there's a lot going on philosophically too. She talks often about her work as a measurement of time, space, and distance. It is also about the way we measure memory and our own past, how we isolate ourselves, how we are divided by fragile and common things like yarn. She's concerned with the comparison between things. She says to measure is to learn. There is handiwork at play and a rigorous art historical sensibility that connects her to illustrious artists like Agnes Martin, Arakawa, Fred Sandback, and others. Her writings reference scientists frequently. She says, "I find that in the artistic production and scientific experimentation, there are similarities in the procedures of investigation when, even if they may spring from a very clear idea, a concept, or a situation, they do not always have a precise question. And however, in the process of production, more than often, the answers are given to questions that were only mere intentions or ideas in the beginning, and which are delimited by the results to be found in the creation of works. In science as well as in art, these are different ways to tackle our experience of the world, to question that which is in it, in order to find personal answers and situations that have already been analyzed. In my case, I consider I have found them." So I found her website. I saw her email on it. So basically, I wrote a fan letter to her. She responded with warmth and gratitude for my interest. She shared with me additional articles about herself and interviews that she's given recently. She wrote to me this week to tell me a little bit more of her story. She joined the church, I think, at age 9 or 10. She's a returned missionary. She and her husband, who's also a fine artist, are members of the church. They have 2 children and live in Mexico City. I said that I'd love to interview her as well and to speak to others about her art. So today I'm making good on that promise. She is relatively young and doesn't have the reputation and credentials of the artists, other artists that I'm discussing today, but she's absolutely on my radar right now. Francisco Estévez. You can tell a lot about an artist by a list of their teachers. It's almost like a pedigree. The Spanish composer Francisco Estévez has a pedigree of teachers that might be the most impressive of any artist in the church's history, not a claim I make casually. Estevez studied in Spain with Gerardo Gambau. After meeting a visiting German composer, Günter Becker, Estevez moved to Dusseldorf to study with him. There he studied with Becker and Milko Kellerman. He became associated with the legendary Darmstadt. He worked with Bernd Weissemann. He was friends with Benjamin Britten. He studied with Olivier Messiaen and credited Messiaen's spirituality with his own spiritual quest, which led to his conversion to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in 1982. He composed award-winning music and received advanced degrees in 3 different countries. Meanwhile, he was part of the music scene that was focusing on electronic sounds in popular music, and Estevez performed with the groundbreaking band Kraftwerk on numerous occasions. I can't recommend his music to you highly enough. His piano quintet Canto de Vida y Esperanza, Song of Life and Hope, written in direct response to the 11M terrorist attacks in his hometown of Madrid only 3 weeks before it was composed, has all hallmarks of a masterpiece to me. His work draws from the gospel in subtle and direct ways too. A massive composition that's still to be performed is his choral work El Sueño de Lehi, Lehi's Dream. In the last 4 years, as I've introduced his work to arts organizations in the church and to performers, Scott Holden, Jennifer Welch Babbage, the Deseret String Quartet, the Barlow Endowment for Music Composition at BYU, and others, they've all been amazed at this man and his music. And they've said to me, how is it possible that we didn't know about him until now? I've gone on record to say that exposure to his music is a prerequisite to Latter-day Saint arts literacy. I visited him and his wife and daughter in Madrid a year ago, where he serves in his bishopric. And I'm happy to say that my discovery of him and his life and music by me and the church in the U.S. has dramatically changed his life and opened wide the floodgates of many new and daring compositions, which makes me happy, as you can imagine, but also eats at me who else is out there. So I think what we'll do is listen to just a fragment of a piece here called Elegía, which is elegy, performed by members of the church. In Europe, there's a regionally organized music festival that happens every other year, and they rotate to different cities, and it's quite cool. It's for full families, so children and teens get together, and they have master classes by extraordinary teachers throughout the week, and all of the adults hang out in this giant chorus that they form, and at the end of the week, they perform a major choral work from the literature. But these all happen at some of the great cathedrals of Europe. So the last one was at the Cathedral of Sagrada Familia in Barcelona. And so here is just a fragment. Yeah, why isn't our festival? Anyway, here is, and if you want to write a check, no, I don't know how that would work. Anyway, so this piece is about 6 or 7 minutes long. I think we'll just listen to a few minutes of it because the camera guy, you'll see, couldn't sit still. And so he starts like circling the room, and like I'm gonna get you seasick if you watch those things. So we'll just watch a little bit of it. It's the newest temple of the church, if you haven't heard that news. press forward because I think we might have a lively discussion if I give us time for it. So there you have it. 4 artists as a sample: Joseph Vorst, Leilei Tian, Georgina Bringas, and Francisco Estévez. The title of my presentation, Global Art from the Global Church, is what you just heard. What makes it global, though? Is it merely that the artists are from outside the U.S.? I think there's more going on here than that. Vorst's intimate knowledge of Germany provided him insight to say to U.S. audiences, I know what fascism is firsthand, and you need to pay attention to what's brewing in Europe. Estevez is actively composing music that bridges his cultures and belief systems. His work, his response to the terrorist attacks in his hometown is an example of work that cries out, listen to what's going on in the world. Leilei Tian is probably the most global artist in the church today. Her work is almost entirely about highlighting, challenging, blending disparate world cultures. Bringas' work is influenced by great international artists, but it is tailored to discussions of her own culture as a microcosm of change in a fast-changing world. In each example, the artists are global in that they are directly creating work intended to be beyond themselves, beyond their national borders. Thematically, their work depends upon a reading that is informed by an interest in and knowledge of the world. It's not enough for them to speak to people just like them, or even to people who believe like they do. So I'm not saying that artists in the church in the U.S. are not global, but I think to question their engagement in the broader world is valid and telling. I want to end with a global vision of my own. I've been interested in the big picture now for a while, as you can probably gather. My anxiety is chiefly that we have been, as a people, ineffective in cataloging and archiving our culture's creative artists, whether they live in the U.S. or not. I maintain a database of Latter-day Saint composers, for example. It currently has 1,600 composers, 100 of them with PhDs in composition. I've cataloged 50,000 works in substantial detail with up to 30 data points for each of these compositions. The center, as Chris was referencing, has taken that database and is creating an encyclopedia and archive on our website. We've just started a similar database for visual artists who are members of the church. Without really trying, we've already amassed 1,800 visual artist names and websites and emails and dates and so forth. I would bet that a more accurate tally of the visual artists in the church is probably 10 times that number. So then there are the LDS authors, filmmakers, choreographers, architects, poets, playwrights, screenwriters, designers. How many of them are there? Where do they live? What kind of work are they making? And let's not forget deceased artists in all their creative fields since the church's founding in 1830. Needless to say, I'm talking about artists all over the world in all of the creative art disciplines. So that's a lot to chew on, isn't it? The potential of that is a lot to chew on. Is this feeling overwhelming to you? My shoulders are definitely feeling it, and sometimes I frankly feel that it's too much. And that's why I'm happy working with the center, and in part why the center exists. In a global church, the artwork we're making speaks to a global audience in ways it has never done before. We're not exporting the gospel to the world any longer. Members and our artists are already living throughout the world. All we have to do is capture their work, care for it, and share it. Your attendance here suggests to me that you care about this too, and for that, on behalf of the artists of the Global Church, I thank you. All right, so I hope that you'll have comments and questions and opinions and insight, and so yes. Yes, Africa is a really interesting dilemma. We've highlighted an artist from Angola named Hildebrando de Melo, who represented his country at the Venice Biennale, so he's, the real deal. Last year at the festival, we helped support the film from a Congolese filmmaker called Heart of Africa that's making its premiere at film festivals throughout the country right now. when the church puts out a call for art, let's say for one of these international competitions, there's a slight problem. Artists, let's say in sub-Saharan Africa, are sending the work that they think the church wants them to send and make, rather than the artwork they're making. And so what it will take, in my opinion, to find this new group of artists is on-the-ground research and gathering data. And because, let's say, in Africa, access to materials might be a significant barrier there. So there might be more of a participation that needs to take place, just like, you know, Margaret is doing with Congolese filmmaking. But you see the same thing in cultures around the world, not just in Africa. You know, Jorge just jumped in to our room. The way that he became known to the church is really quite not direct. So he submitted work to an international festival, an international art competition a long time ago, and it kind of passed without a lot of notice. And then Jack and Jeannie and other people said, and Laura said, wow, Laura Hurtado at the Church History Museum got behind him and started a whole new venue of exploration. But, you know, if you were asked to talk about Jorge's full body of work, you would only have the last hour of his timeline. The other stuff in his body of work is extraordinary and speaks directly to his culture in dynamic and exciting ways that position it with some of the great artists of the Southern Hemisphere. So even that is an example of someone who, let's say, has broken through. We're not getting even the full story of that, right? To say nothing of the differences between men and women artists and our ability to recognize them, indigenous peoples, Native American peoples, as one example. So there's a lot of work to be done. I thought it might be fun to choose these 4 examples that are working at such a high level, you cannot dismiss them. Like you maybe might not, their work might not appeal to you directly on first hearing or first sight, but there's enough going on that you just can't say, you know, not legit, right? So. I'm going to make you sing hymns.
Other than cataloging it, which is an incredible feat, what do you see as the purpose of the catalog? How do people use that catalog once it's built and created?
Yeah, so I'll give you an example. I'm going to give this example again tonight, but when we decided to do this festival here, one of the things that they wanted to do was to do a concert. And I said, you know, it would be great if we just used Texas composers. And they said, well, other than me, the guy speaking who was a composer, I don't think there are any. And I was able to say, here are the 30, and here are their emails, and half of them have PhDs and teach at the university level, and they live really close to you. They don't know each other. They're working in really interesting ways. They could be collaborating, but they just haven't met each other. So I'm not a smart enough person to really be the one to make sense of all the data, ultimately, but the first step has to be gathering the data. It really does have to be. And another example of this, when the church decided to make their call for the new hymnal, I was able to say to them, you know, would it be helpful if I were to send you the emails from composers in 26 countries, and there are about 1,000 of them? Would that be appealing to you? And, you know, those were not names that they knew, because the church has not been in the music commissioning business. What they've been doing is trying to catch up with translations. So they know translators in languages that most of us have never even heard of, but those composers they have not been actively courting. So that was an important bridge for them. The same thing with the Barlow Endowment for Music Composition. It was one of the great organizations of the church, and you know, BYU. It's housed at BYU, but it has an international reputation. I mean, they have Pulitzer Prize winners who have come from the Barlow, and and they came to me last year and they said, our reach is just really small. We reach out to the same composers over and over. And I was able to say, well, here you go. Like, let's see if we can broaden the discourse. So, you know, those are some examples. Uh-huh. That's exactly the way it works. So, yeah, so you know, according to my friend who's a senior VP of intellectual property at Warner Brothers, doing a catalog like this doesn't enter into copyright issues at all. And so what we do then is, you know, let's say, you know, Crawford Symphony No. 1. We have Crawford Gates American, his dates, Symphony No. 1, when it was premiered, who conducted it, what its instrumentation was, if it was recorded, if it was dedicated to somebody, if it had text, who wrote that text, if it was published, who published it, his website. So we have that kind of detail for every composition, about 50,000 of them. And so if you were interested, you would say, in a quick search, let's say you played in a string quartet. You could go to our website, which is, you know, it's in the process, but this is how it's envisioned. You could type string quartet, and up would come the roughly 180 string quartets that I know about by members of who are members of the church. And then, if they're deceased, one of our things is what libraries there, where you might find them. And also, it's not too difficult to do research like that. And then most composers who are living today have websites, and it's quite easy to find them, to contact them. So we're kind of in a golden age, and younger composers think that that is going to be perpetual. But what I'm finding is that there's a lot of danger. Like, you know, they put all their music, let's say, on SoundCloud, thinking that that's going to be around forever. And then SoundCloud announces, well, maybe we're going to go to a different kind of model, and all that music could literally disappear in a weekend. So this idea of gathering is a really significant issue. A pianist friend of mine was getting her master's degree at Juilliard, and she came to me, and she's LDS, and she said, I would love to perform a work by an LDS composer at my master's degree recital. What is the LDS archive for music? And I said, oh, there is no such thing. Like, you can't go to Salt Lake and go to the church office building or the church history museum or the church history department and type, you know, for music. It doesn't exist. And even a great place like BYU that has been really amazing in the last few years, but not historically, gathering music, they go through periods where it becomes exciting to them and a mission for it, and then times when they say, wow, we're running out of space. We don't have time for that. Or people inside the department will say, we're not the church's archive. That needs to, and so it's quite spotty, right? So even just knowing that the things existed is valuable. But we're talking about potentially not just music, but, you know, everything. We should be able to, in today's age, to say, I need 80 poets' names, like now. And then we should be able to find out where those books are. We should have metadata in there that's searchable enough that a scholar saying, I'm doing research on the influence of, you know, Eliza R. Snow on 21st century playwriting. You should be able to do that, to facilitate that. And so it has been centralized in the Intermountain West, but now with technology as it is, that doesn't need to be the case. And I've been speaking about global artists. Work in translation is really, really difficult. But the tools for translation are becoming so much more effective that even that isn't the barrier it was even 5 years ago. And so the excuse that we used to have, well, I can't understand what's going on in Latin American short fiction because I don't have access to them. Well, those excuses are going away. So the things that remain are, why aren't we interested enough to really tackle it? That seems a little harsh, but, you know, we zealots need to be. Did you have a? Yes, both of those things are terrific. So, so this center, its purpose has always been to be as inclusive as possible. So if people self-identify in any way as members of the church, we've always said, bring it. And one of the cool things has been involving people who have distanced themselves from the church for one reason or another and have just really missed that relationship. When I was doing this research on these composers, I came across the name of one who just had a ton of listings. He's in upstate New York and just a ton of performances and recordings. And I wrote to him and I said, here's this thing that I'm working on. And he says, I don't want to email about it. Let's just talk on the phone. So he calls me up and we're talking about his life and his music. And he said, I'm gay. I left the church about 20 years ago. I'm a returned missionary. I love everything about the church so much. I can't personally feel comfortable there, but everything that I do is through the filter of my belief system, which is solidly LDS. I just finished an opera called Nephi. So I was hard-pressed to say, oh, well, that's not Mormon art, right? I just couldn't justify that, right? So then, does that, I mean, it sounds flippant, but that was a real eye-opening moment for me. And then the second thing is, your question was like, how do we get information? I probably get emails at least one a day from somebody who says, have you heard of this person? And like, I'm all over it. I mean, I completely love that. And so on our website, you know, it's at centerforlatterdaysaintarts.org. There's a little box, and if you want to send me a note or something like that. And you know, this Georgina story, it was just because somebody I had never met before here in Dallas said, I just met this person. I think you really would be all over her. And it turns out that her husband is equally fantastic, huge international career. I mean, these are real A-listers. And the guy from Angola was a similar story. I had a friend who worked for Chevron, and he's a chemist, so he zips around to oil fields all over the world. And he was in Luanda, Angola, about 10 years ago, and he just sent me a note, and he said, there's this guy. I think you should meet him. And so then we corresponded, you know, for 10 years. And so yes, group sourcing things is just the complete awesome way to do it. There's another aspect, it's a little bit tangential, but one aspect of LDS visual arts culture is it's a little bit weird in the sense that if you're a famous artist and you die, typically your artwork would go off to an auction house, or it would go off to a second gallery, right, to a resale kind of gallery. But in the church, that's not what happens. Where would your artworks go? No, they would go to your kids. So all of these family members then have all this artwork that is not open to scholarship. Like, it's really hard, as you probably know, it's really hard to track down artwork from artists because they disperse and never pop up again. And so you don't know what's around. So this idea of, you know, there's no catalog rationale of a single LDS artist that I'm aware of, for example. That level of full cataloging of an artist doesn't exist. But it will. We got to get going on it. No, I don't know anything. That's what I keep telling myself every morning when I wake up. It's like, there's so much more I don't know. And that would be a whole other level of really fascinating stuff. I would love to have that kind of information because there are probably people who are experts in a related field who live close enough that they could just take over, you know, a box lunch and have a great time and really catalog stuff. So I think that would be fantastic. Well, the time is far spent. 5 o'clock. The mall is calling me for some dinner. Thanks so much, everybody. I hope you had a great time so far at the festival. Thank you very much.